Receiving the SIGCHI Social Impact Award. I normally am not I don't normally like formal introductions and listing all of someone's accomplishments, but in this case I actually think it's important because it sets the context for why we as a community are recognizing Jonathan. Dr. Jonathan Lazar, a professor of computer and information sciences at Towson University in Maryland in the United States, has devoted his life to combining research on user diversity with policy advocacy to ensure that the best research will improve the quality of life for people with disabilities. And he does that while connecting students with the societal impacts of their HCI coursework as well. Let me just mention some of the advocacy activities that have been so impactful. Dr. Lazar has served as an advisor to the White House, U.S. Treasury, U.S. Federal Recovery Accountability and Transparency Board, and the U.S. Department of Justice. He provided testimony to the U.S. Department of Justice, U.S. Access Board, and Federal Chief Information Officer Council. And at the Maryland state level, he served as an advisor to the Maryland Department of Disabilities and the Maryland Department of Information Technology. He has repeatedly testified to the Maryland State Senate and House of Delegates. Two direct outcomes of his advocacy are U.S. Department of Transportation regulations on airline web and kiosk accessibility, and a Maryland 2014 law that increases the focus on teaching IT accessibility concepts at Maryland universities. And Jonathan has put a corresponding amount of effort into SIGCHI as well. He chaired the SIGCHI U.S. Public Policy Committee and then became the SIGCHI Adjunct Chair for Public Policy over a period of 10 years. He was also Digital Accessibility Chair for CHI 2014 and on the editorial board of ACM Interactions magazine for 6 years as the Public Policy Forum editor. He was also the lead author of the SIGCHI Public Policy Framework Report, which came out last year, and that will be presented tomorrow afternoon. And of course, his work goes way beyond even that list. I just selected the most important things. But I promise you, having known him as a Marylander and friend and colleague for many, many years, his commitment to these issues is unending, and he is deeply deserving of the SIGCHI Social Impact Award. So please help me in welcoming Jonathan.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you. Very kind. Thank you. All right, good morning, everyone. Good morning. So my title slide actually starts with logos representing all the different universities I've been affiliated with and the different research groups over the past 3 decades. And that's important because I want to start with how I got interested in HCI. Where does my HCI story start? Interestingly enough, this is where my HCI story starts, right? I started college as an undergraduate who was majoring in economics. And I found after taking a few econ classes, it just really wasn't for me. And at the time, I was taking Introduction to Information Systems. And I had a professor, and you see right there, that's Professor Meg Richards over there on the left. And she said, you know, if you're not sure what major, if you always like computers, you should think about technology. She said, you know, there's this research lab. They have an open house. It's called the Human-Computer Interaction Lab at the University of Maryland. Come with me for a day. What have you got to lose? Just come down. You can see, first time I'd ever heard the phrase human-computer interaction before. And so I came down and I came to the research lab. Of course, Ben Schneiderman sitting in the front row here. He actually takes pictures of nearly everything, as you know. And due to that, there is a picture of me on my first day in HCI more than 25 years ago. So there I am on the left, right? That was my first day in HCI. And I was there and I was hearing all about how technology can be used to improve the quality of life. It can be used to improve communication. It can be used to help people with disabilities, and that's what HCI was all about. It was about making an impact on society and making the quality of life better. And I heard that and I said, aha, that's what I want to major in. That's what I want to do. And that is literally a picture of my first day in HCI. Next Monday, I came in and I changed majors, and I've been doing HCI ever since. So that's where my story with HCI starts. It was all about using technology to help people, to improve the quality of life. And thank you again, Ben, for taking pictures, because now I have a picture of my first day. So when we go to graduate school and we study HCI, what are we taught how to do? We are taught to teach classes and do research, to make presentations at conferences, maybe apply for grants, maybe serve on some committees. But rarely in a graduate school program are we taught to do social impact. But publishing a paper isn't the end. People say, oh good, I published my paper, I'm done. No, publishing a paper is just the beginning. We have to figure out how can we use that research for societal good. Because if we only stay inside our university, inside our research labs, even industrial labs, inside our core research communities, we reach a very limited audience. We only reach our current students, we only reach our colleagues, we only reach technology in that company. We only reach people that we already know. I mean, let's face it, the CHI conference is awesome. It's a lot of fun, there are a lot of friendly places, it's welcoming, if you've been coming for years, it's your home research community, and that's great. But we have to get outside of the HCI community. We have to reach people who are not familiar with HCI. We have to figure out how we can meet their needs. We have to figure out how we can improve society. And if you think about it, everything that we've learned about user-centered design, right, it teaches us to go out and work with users and reach users and get out there and learn what people need and figure out how to understand organizational context, community context, political context. One of the recent research trends in HCI has been towards crowdsourcing, right? Getting data using crowdsourcing and using sensors and analyzing a million tweets and using big data approaches and crowdsourcing approaches, and that's great. That's another tool in our research toolbox. But it removes us from our user communities, right? We are not as close on a daily basis with the organizations, with the communities, with the people for whom our technology can have a major life impact. And so that research is great, but we need to recommit. We need to recommit to connecting with our user communities, with organizations, with education, with public policy. We need to get out there because we always talk about users, tasks, and environment. Remember, environment. We need to get out there in the environment, in the community, in other research communities, in practitioner communities, in policy communities, and law communities. Understand what people need in their homes. We need to make sure that we're getting out there if we want to really understand how to have a true impact. So that's what I want to ask everyone to do. I want to make sure we are out there speaking to other communities, not just the CHI community. Reaching out to educational communities, go to advocacy groups, right? Get in the general public consciousness. Write op-ed articles, work on tech transfer, work on corporate R&D. We have to get out there and connect with as many different groups as possible because this is how we are going to make sure that our work has a societal impact, that we are out there using technology to improve the world. So don't start out with the question, what research do I want to do? What do I want to accomplish? Instead, go ask real user communities. What do you need? Where are the problems? Where are the gaps? How can we help? That's something I've been doing for a number of years. I've been doing partnerships with a number of organizations over 10, 15 years in some cases. For instance, the National Federation of the Blind. I've been collaborating with them for over 15 years. The National Down Syndrome Congress. Baltimore County Public Libraries. We've been doing projects over the years. And you never know which partnerships will start out and maybe last a year, and which ones will last 15 years. You never know. But I want to ask everyone to go outside of your box of comfort. I want to ask all of us to go outside of our boxes and be uncomfortable. Be very uncomfortable. Get comfortable being uncomfortable. Go out to communities that you're not familiar with. Go out to organizations where the first time you hear it, you think, wow, that's different. I want us to get outside and be uncomfortable. I saw this news article. Academics can change the world if they stop talking only to their peers. I saw that and I said, that's exactly what I'm thinking. And there are two very interesting quotes in that article. One was that the average journal article is read completely by no more than 10 people. Think about how hard you work on your articles and only 10 people read it. Right? What can we do to make sure that our research, our work, has more impact? The article also said that universities don't do a great deal to encourage academics to move beyond lecture halls and laboratories. So the question then is, what can we do to encourage our community? What can we do as individuals to go out there and make a difference. You know, a presentation like this gives you the opportunity to look back and see the trajectory of your career and see where the work started and how you've been influenced. So one of my first projects related to human-computer interaction was in the early 1990s. I was a student at Loyola College. It's now Loyola University, Maryland. And I was in student government. And we had a discussion that commuter students, which are a very small percentage of the campus, they weren't getting the same information as resident students. Because remember, this was before there were email accounts on campus. This is before websites, early 1990s. Remember the context. So when there are campus events, what they would do is they would send out the campus event information on a voicemail system. And all the resident students received messages. Here's a concert coming up. There's going to be a testing of the emergency alarms, things like that. And the commuter students received no information. So I worked in student government to find a way that they could set up voicemail boxes for commuter students to make sure that they got those same messages. Looking back, I realized this was my first project where I was trying to figure out how could we use technology to ensure that underrepresented populations had equal access to information. Looking back, there is a direct correlation between that work and the work I do today on accessibility. And over the years, I've really pushed my students to get involved with the community. And I've tried to focus all of my classes on community-based projects. So for instance, in web development classes that I've taught, I've had students go out, work to either design new websites for community organizations or redesign existing websites. I've had my students go out and do accessibility inspections, where they check to determine if web pages are accessible for people with disabilities. I've had students do studies of legal compliance, where they either check legal compliance with, again, accessibility rules and laws, or maybe they go out and see if the proper statements are on the website related to privacy or information gathering. I've actually had my students work with, for instance, Baltimore County Public Libraries to determine how their procurement process could be improved, right? How can we make sure that when the public library is procuring databases and technology, that that technology is usable and accessible for the widest population possible? So yes, procurement documents. I've worked with my students to document discriminatory pricing. When people with disabilities are charged more because you have a website that's inaccessible, and when you call the call center and say, hi, I'm blind, your website doesn't work for me, they actually charge you a higher price. So I've worked with my students on that. Even my doctoral dissertation was about community partnerships. I worked with the Archdiocese of Baltimore. At the time, they had just hooked up, right, their schools and their parishes to the internet, and they hadn't trained anyone. And I said, ooh, I could train people. If they could take part in my data collection for my dissertation, they said, well, how many could you train? 10, 20? I said, as many as you want. They said, well, how about 250? I said, great, let's do it. Right? So there's always some way in your coursework, in your degree programs, to find a great community partnership, to reach outside of your university or your company to the general community. One of the things I do, I have a class that focuses on technology design for people who are blind. It's all about designing technology, websites, operating systems to work for people who are blind or low vision. And as part of this, I have the students go out and they visit 4 different sites. They visit Blind Industries and Services of Maryland, right, where people learn. If you're losing your vision, you learn basically all the skills you need. You learn cane skills, you learn Braille, you learn technology. And I always start with that field trip because that field trip is the one that shatters the misperceptions of my students. Once my students see blind individuals using power tools to build furniture, they say, wait a minute, blind people really can do anything that they want to do. Oh, this is just a design challenge then. Once you remove that discrimination, then it's just a design challenge. Okay, well, how do we design it so it'll work? And then I bring my students to other places, like the National Federation of the Blind and their Technology Center, like the Maryland Library for the Blind, right? Like the Maryland Technology Assistance Program. Even on campus, I've worked with students and with other administrators and other faculty to create a cross-campus accessibility coalition. We have a group of 30 faculty and staff across the campus at Towson University who are all interested in disability issues. They teach about disability, they do research about disabilities, they work directly with students with disabilities. And so there's so many different things that you could do. I want to talk a little bit about my research interests related to accessibility. What I'm really interested in, we have all this existing knowledge on how to make technology work for people with disabilities. We have technical guidelines, like the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, which are probably the best known accessibility guidelines in the world. There are also a set of guidelines in how you apply those concepts to non-web technologies, and that's known as WCAG2 ICT. So we have technical guidelines. We have inclusive design processes. We have great inclusive design processes. We know how to include people in the design process. We've got evaluation methods. We know how to do user testing. We know how to do expert inspections. We've got the knowledge. So given that we have all this technical knowledge and process knowledge, and we have government policies that may require accessibility, why is it we always wind up with information systems that are not accessible for people with disabilities? How do we get the existing knowledge to be implemented? How do we get that knowledge to be applied so that our systems wind up being more inclusive and more accessible? So I've always been very deeply interested in that. I've always been interested in how do we get that knowledge to work? And so you go into the context, you study the organization, you look at compliance monitoring techniques, as I've done. You interview people in the government who are in charge of accessibility. You determine how different tools could be used, right? What are the development processes? What more information needs to be out there? Where are the gaps? What do people not understand? But we have to be honest that there are some areas where we still need lots of research on accessibility. So for instance, the area of cognitive impairment. People with cognitive impairments. We know very little about how to design technology for people with cognitive impairments compared to what we know about perceptual and motor impairments. We know a lot about how to build for people who are deaf or hard of hearing, people who are blind or low vision, people who have limited use of hands, people who have limited use of speech. We have a great research tradition about that. But there are frontiers of research, right? How do you make visualizations accessible, for instance, for blind users, right? How do people with Down syndrome interact with technology? If you have a cognitive impairment, how does that relate to touchscreen usage? So there are some frontiers where we still need, it's not just applying what we know, there are still some frontiers. But the overall goal should be improving the quality of life for people with disabilities, making sure that everyone has equal access. That doesn't just mean technical access. That means equivalent usability. If you say, well, technically there is a way to do it, right? But it'll take the average person who can see 10 seconds and the average blind user 5 minutes. That's not equivalent usability. That's like saying, well, there is a way to get into the building if you're in a wheelchair, but you have to go up 3 different elevators and go through the back. That's not equivalent access. So we need to make sure as a community that we ensure there's equal access to information, because access to the web, access to apps, access to operating systems, all the digital information that we expect, that will lead to better outcomes in employment, in education, in commerce, in communication for people with disabilities. And that really should be our goal. Over the years, I've worked with many different organizations, nonprofit organizations, government agencies, right? And it's always been a pleasure to work with all these organizations. Some of them start out as just, hey, Jonathan Lazar, hi, I'm calling from such organization. Could you give us some advice? Could you look over some materials? So for instance, the Treasury Department, that was a very short-term engagement. They just had some quick questions. Right? They wanted me to review some materials, review some screens, review some reports. Recovery.gov. That was a project that Ben Schneiderman and I worked on for 2 years. We advised them. He advised on general usability, and I advised on accessibility. And we made sure that the website, with all of its data and visualizations, was accessible for people with disabilities and complied with Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act. The White House has been fantastic to communicate with. So President Obama actually has an advisor in the Office of Public Engagement that focuses specifically on disability policy and the disability community. And so I've had the opportunity to go to the White House a number of times, to meet with the advisor, to discuss some of my research and how it relates to regulations, to present. Last fall, I had the opportunity to present at the White House to the Domestic Policy Council and OIRA, the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, right, about the regulatory process and technology for people with disabilities. So it's been fantastic. It's been a fantastic experience. There have been a number of different people who have served in this role at the White House, but throughout the Obama administration, there's always been this role of disability policy advisor, and that person is very interested in technology. So the National Federation of the Blind, their national headquarters is in Baltimore, and they have a room that has one of every technology in the world for blind people. And I've spent a lot of time collaborating with them, over 15 years, having my students visit them, working on research collaborations, speaking at their conventions, right? Working on projects together, and I'll talk about one of those projects a little bit later. Baltimore County Public Library. I've done projects that have partnered with BCPL and with the American Library Association about how do you make library resources more usable? How do you make e-government resources easier to access for patrons? How do you make technology, websites, resources more accessible for people with disabilities? If you're a public library, how do you start serving people with print disabilities with some of your digital resources? For about 4 or 5 years, I partnered with the National Down Syndrome Congress to work on research about how people with Down syndrome interact with technology. The Maryland Library for the Blind, I've served on their advisory board or their Friends board for almost a decade. I work with the Association of Research Libraries on their accessibility and usability working group. There are so many great organizations out there to partner with. There's so many great organizations where our knowledge of HCI could be utilized for societal good. And I want everyone to realize that your research and your teaching, your work can have a major impact outside of the HCI community. But if you're going to spend a lot of time outside of the HCI community, you do have to learn about how other communities operate, what their standards are. So for instance, if you're going to spend a lot of time outside of the HCI community, it's really important to make sure that you have some journal articles. Now, conferences are great. I mean, we're all here at CHI. Conferences are fun, and to submit to conferences is fun. You know when the deadline is, you get a quick turnaround time, right? It's very satisfying. You get to come, you get to present, you get to interact with people. Conferences are very satisfying. But if you're going to work with people in public policy, if you're going to work with lawyers, if you're going to work with people in education, right? In those fields, as in most other academic fields, journals are how they communicate their research, not conference papers. And so make sure that you take some time, take your conference papers, expand them into journals, add new research, find journals that will say, yes, we'll take an expanded CHI paper with a lot of new data and a lot of new insights. Do summary articles of your research, because when you put it in journals, it becomes a currency that other fields understand. To get involved in government and policy is to understand that there are so many different forms of public policy. So we've got, for instance, statutory laws. When we think of government policy, people often think of, well, there's a law. But also, there are regulations that help interpret the law. So we have regulations that give technical guidance on how you implement a law, how you implement an issue that's come up that is believed to be of importance. There's also case law. If you look at court cases, that's a great opportunity. Become an expert witness, as a number of people in the HCI community have done. Become an expert witness. Get involved with the legal community. Realize that there are other forms of public policy, like signing statements and executive orders, administrative decrees. If you get involved in a technical standards organization, like W3C or like ISO, right? Those are all organizations that create technical standards. We can play a role, but often governments around the world, they adopt those technical standards. And so you really do influence public policy when you get involved with a technical standards effort. When you help document best practices, that's an important role too. It's not good enough just to complain about what's wrong. You need to come up with solutions. You need to document solutions and say, we discovered these problems, here are some ways to improve it. Right? You wouldn't ever do a usability test and say, we discovered all these problems, they're bad, period. Right? you come up with, here are some suggested solutions. Here are some changes that we could make. I spend a lot of time at the state and federal level in the United States working with policymakers. And one time, one of these policymakers said something that always stuck in my mind, which is, Jonathan, you do research that actually answers questions that I have. It's important if you're going to go out there and work in government and in the policy community that you understand that just presenting your research that you've done in your labs, in your industrial labs at your universities, that's not enough. You have to actually have answers to questions that policymakers have. You need to know what are their pressing issues, right? So it's important to schedule face-to-face time with policymakers. You can't just say, here's a Chi paper I wrote. I'm going to send it to you. I hope you find this useful. It's not going to be in a format they understand. They're not going to trust it, and they're probably not going to read it. You're lucky if you have one legislative assistant who might read it. So what you want to do is schedule time. This is the way public policy works. Meet with people. Say, I've done some research that relates to this regulation. I would like to talk to you more about this. Could we set up a time to meet? For regulatory processes, in most countries, regulatory processes are open. You can respond to a regulatory process, right? You can give feedback, as can anyone from the public. So you should give feedback. Know when those deadlines are, right? If the deadline is May 1st, don't submit the feedback to the regulation on May 2nd because it won't count. Know the statistics. If you're going to work with policymakers, know the statistics of that population because policymakers always want to know, well, how many constituents do I have? You're telling me all about web access for people with disabilities. How many blind people are in my district? How many blind people are in my state? How many people does it impact? So you can provide testimony to your legislature. Anytime there's a bill that comes up where you have some expertise, sign up to testify. Get on government advisory committees. There are lots of opportunities for us as HCI researchers, practitioners, and educators to get involved. Right? One easy way, get involved with US ACM and EU ACM. There are two public policy groups sponsored by ACM. Right? And those groups basically include people from the computer science community to respond to rulemaking processes and things like that. In Europe and in the US, unfortunately, they don't have groups yet outside of the EU and the US. They're working on that. Encourage them to. Contact ACM. There are also organizations of people from the HCI community, such as the Center for Civic Design, right, who they also are great organizations to get involved with and contribute your HCI knowledge. Here's an example of how I was involved with the legislature. And here's a picture from a bill signing in 2014. For a number of years, the disability advocates in Maryland had put forward a bill about making sure that public accommodations will be accessible. Public accommodations in terms of technology, websites and other technologies would be accessible for people with disabilities. And every year I went to testify on behalf of this bill, and this bill never went anywhere. Right? It never got passed. But in the last year that we had tried this, some of the business advocates who were there lobbying in Annapolis said, the problem is we just don't have enough people in the state of Maryland with knowledge of how to make technology accessible. We don't know who would we hire. And so the next year, the disability advocates said, well, we're going to put forth a new bill then. We're going to work with our legislators and put forth a new bill. And this was primarily headed by the National Federation of the Blind, the Maryland chapter of NFB. And so they contacted me and said, Jonathan, what if we made it a regulation? What if we tried to put together a bill, something to increase how much IT accessibility content is taught at Maryland universities? How would that work? You're a faculty member. How do you think that would work? And I said, oh, well, I did a keynote speech, actually, in 2011 at the Accessing Higher Ground conference about teaching more about accessibility. They said, great, send it to us. We'll send it to our legislators. So before I knew it, there was this bill going through the state legislature based on a keynote speech I had given and some ideas that the National Federation of the Blind had about increasing how much content is taught. So of course, I went to testify on behalf of this bill, right? First time around, right? It went through the House, it went through the Senate, it was passed by both, and then it was signed into law by Governor Martin O'Malley. So here's the bill signing in May 2014. You've got Speaker of the House and President of the Senate surrounding Martin O'Malley in the middle. Right? Some of the people that you have on this picture here All the way on the left, you have the Maryland Department of Disabilities, the Secretary of the Maryland Department of Disabilities, right? I'm one to the right from him. Then you have a few legislators, and you have members of the National Federation of the Blind of Maryland who also worked really hard. And it's amazing. People say, you can't change policy, right? You actually can, right? If you get involved, if you build long-term relationships, and that's the key, build long-term relationships. If you want to change the law, if you want to change policies and regulations, if you want to make a difference, start building long-term relationships with your legislators, with advocates. Because you see, this is one example and I've got others. You can make a difference. It is totally possible. It just takes time and often skills that we don't learn in graduate school. Often we are involved in building prototypes. We love to build prototypes, right? We'll do some quick data collection, we'll write up a paper about it, and we'll move on. And I say, don't just move on. Why let other people follow through with your prototypes? Take your prototypes and keep building on them. Focus on the same prototype. Focus on building on it. Focus on turning it into a product. Focus on partnering with organizations. Focus on partnering with community groups. So work with your university's tech transfer office, right? If you're in an industrial lab, find ways to not just say it's a prototype, but find ways to get it into your actual products. If you're at a university, find corporate partners. Now to do this, let's be honest, you may have to learn a little bit about intellectual property law. It's not that scary. IP law is actually very interesting and very technical, and many IP lawyers also have technical backgrounds. So they're fun to work with. They are, they're fun to work. IP lawyers are fun to work with. A few people are laughing, but it's true, they are. So I'm going to describe a project that we did over a 7-year period. This wasn't actually a project that I started out saying, I want to build accessible CAPTCHAs. The National Federation of the Blind came to us and said, you know, many websites are adding these CAPTCHA, these security features. Many websites are adding them. The visual ones are not accessible to blind users. And the existing ones for blind users, the audio ones, are very hard to use. What could you do about this? Do you have any ideas? What could you do? So we did multiple surveys. We did focus groups. We created some ideas. We did some usability testing. We built some more prototypes. And we kept going at it over a 7-year period. Every time we'd tweak it, we'd make some improvements, we'd do more user testing, we'd go back to our security folks and say, okay, is this one secure? How can we make this one more secure? What changes? Do you see any weaknesses? And over a 7-year period, this led to some great outcomes. So there's a picture there of the award we received from the local paper for being an Innovator of the Year in 2009. We received funding from the Maryland Technology Development Corporation to turn this project into a proof of concept in industry. We received 2 patents from the US PTO, 2 patents for our different versions of accessible CAPTCHAs. And in the end, right, the university signed 2 licensing agreements with other outside companies that were going to take this project forward. So we didn't just say, this was nice, I built a prototype, I got a Chi paper. We said, let's keep at it. What's still wrong with this? What can we do to improve it? How can we make it better? I want to challenge you also to go out to the community that you live in. Figure out what are the needs of that community. Go talk with people. Go outside your university boundaries and figure out, how can we use the resources of the university, of an industrial lab, to improve the quality of life? Maybe there's some apps that could be built. Maybe you could allow the community into your maker spaces, into your technology labs. Maybe you could create STEM programs for youth. The morning plenary that we just had was about coding and having diverse populations of young kids learn how to code. These are the types of things that we should be involved with, that we should be reaching out to the community to figure out, what do they need? Do they need education for young kids? Do they need training? How can we make a difference in the community? I want to talk a little bit about my experience with the legal community. It's been fascinating. I'd never considered studying law. This isn't my background. But over time, I saw that the real impact in implementing accessibility for people with disabilities came from the legal community. It came from the disability advocates. It came from the lawyers who were effectively using laws and the courts to improve the accessibility of technology. Right? And these things do make a big difference. Right? If you look at well-known cases like the Target.com or the settlement with Monster.com, or Scribd, or a recent settlement with Amazon.com. You know, having access to commerce, having access to education, to books for people with disabilities, these are real impacts. These are real outcomes. It really makes a difference in the outcome of their life. And so the more I've interacted with lawyers and with law students, one of the most fascinating things is that for many of them, they don't have a deep understanding of the technical issues, just as HCI researchers, many times we don't have a deep understanding of the legal issues. So, for instance, you talk with a lawyer, they'll say, great, the law requires this, you go fix it. And you ask for clarification. Well, what does the law require, and what level of fixing do I need to do, and are there guidelines? Well, the law requires it, fix it. You're technical experts, that's your problem. And so they don't really have a deep understanding of the technology. On the flip side, we often, as HCI researchers, as all computer scientists, will say, the law requires. Well, wait a minute, which law? That's a mistake we often make. The law requires. There is a law. Okay, there is a law. Well, would you like to name the law? What law is it? What does it require? Is it the Americans with Disabilities Act Title III, or is it Title II? Who does it cover? Can you cite the regulations related to the law? So it's really a fascinating collaboration. Even the difference between technical standards and performance standards, right? And understanding, okay, if we've done user testing, we've documented that maybe the technical standards don't mention this solution. Like for a number of years, the technical standards did not mention touchscreen access for blind users. But our touchscreens today, many of them, in our mainline systems, are accessible for blind users. So how do we balance that? How do we make sure that the laws and the regulations acknowledge that there may be solutions that haven't been developed yet, but are actually better than what you have in the technical standard? It's been fascinating because there are all these interesting intersections where there's miscommunication. For instance, there is a law in Maryland, and it's called the Maryland IT Non-Visual Access Law. And it requires in Maryland that all state government technology be accessible for people with disabilities. From a technical point of view, the guidelines, the technical guidelines, are the same as Section 508. It's a modified version of the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, but version 1.0. But in the Maryland state law, it says that the University System of Maryland receives an exemption from this law. And I was like, wait a minute, that doesn't make any sense. Why would you exempt universities from this law? Well, it turns out that because federal law trumps state law, right, the universities are not exempted from federal law. So they basically have the same standards. And the universities don't actually get exempted from these standards. It's just that someone wanted it put into this bill before it's signed into law, right, that the university system gets an exemption. But legally, they don't. As a computer scientist, I have trouble understanding that. I grapple with that. Or an example is, for instance, with the Marrakesh Treaty, which is a recently signed treaty related to human rights and intellectual property to ensure that there are exemptions in copyright law so that people with print disabilities can get access to printed materials through the transformation of the format. So turning it from a printed book into large print, braille, digital, audio. Right? And so the Marrakesh Treaty is basically an international treaty that relates to making sure there are exemptions if a country signs on and ratifies, that there are exemptions in their national law to make sure that organizations can transform the format for people with print disabilities, and that there are also cross-border flows. So if you have made an accessible version of Harry Potter in Canada, you should be able to send it to the UK, Australia, or the US, right? Whereas currently in most intellectual property treaties, you cannot do that. So it was very interesting. I was with a group of lawyers who were focusing on the Marrakesh Treaty. And they said, well, according to these laws, though, in each country, you would have to monitor to make sure that the accessible version did not go to someone without a print disability. We have no idea how you would do that. How would you do that? And I said, well, you do what bookshare.org does. You do what the libraries for the blind and physically handicapped do, right? There's a certification process. You use a password-protected site. There are already technical solutions. And they said, really? This has been done? That's why we need to have more of these conversations. In many cases, there are technical solutions to questions that people in other communities have, and we can say, we've already solved that. Let's work on doing a great implementation. This is a picture of one of the most interesting talks I think that I've ever given. Last year, Kai was in Seoul, South Korea. Right? How many people in the audience here were at Kai last year in Seoul? Raise your hands. All right. It's a fantastic conference. So I'd mentioned to one of my advocate friends that I would be going to Seoul, South Korea. And he said, oh, great, great. I'm going to let a friend or two of mine know. And a few days later, I received an invitation to speak at the Korean Disability Law Association, a group of Korean lawyers who focus on disability law. Right? And so I was honored to present to this group and talk about my work. And I talked both about US laws, but also just about the technologies and the guidelines we have, and what we, as the HCI community, can contribute to disability communities anywhere in the world. This was truly a fascinating and exciting talk that I gave. I've also been very lucky to be able to interact with and collaborate on books with lawyers and legal scholars. So when I was on sabbatical at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard University, I focused on writing a book. And I was sitting in on law classes to help get a better understanding of law. And this book is Ensuring Digital Accessibility Through Process and Policy. And I collaborated with Dan Goldstein, who's a well-known civil rights lawyer. So if you've heard of the Target case or the Scribd case, or even the early cases against Apple and Cardtronics, right, and AOL, Dan Goldstein was the lawyer at the head of those cases. So I co-authored this book with Dan Goldstein and with Ann Taylor, who used to head Access Technology at the National Federation of the Blind, but now works at Microsoft. And it's really an interesting book. It's a hybrid of law, policy, and HCI. So it helps lawyers understand the technical side. It helps those with a legal background understand what the technical guidelines are, how we use evaluation methods, right? Technical background. It helps computer scientists and people in HCI and accessibility understand the legal side. What do these laws mean? What do they cover? So we have information about best practices. We have information about organizations who are doing this right. We have information in the book about compliance monitoring techniques, because no one ever talks about that. Well, how do we make sure that we stay accessible? We built it accessibly. What techniques can we use to make sure that it stays accessible? So that was a fun project involving two people from very different backgrounds, but it was great. We're very proud of that product. And recently, I've been collaborating with a legal scholar, with Michael Stein at Harvard Law School. And we have a book coming out with the University of Pennsylvania Press next year about global inclusion, disability, human rights, and information technology. And this book looks at the intersection of human-computer interaction, disability rights law, human rights law, where there are areas that are really unsolved at this point. You have situations where, for instance, the law is very clear, but we haven't solved things from a technical point of view. So if you look at the area of cognitive impairment, right? The laws in the United States, the Americans with Disabilities Act, in other countries as well, the Equality Act in the UK, Stanca Act in Italy, there are many laws around the world, and they say people with cognitive impairment do have a right to access technology and equal access. As computer scientists, we haven't really solved yet how they get access. We have a lot of work we need to do. At the same time, there are other intersections where the law is not well defined, but the technology is. So if you look at, for instance, captioning a video, we know how to caption. We've been doing captioning for 40 years. Captioning is easy. It's technically solved. But from a legal point of view, there are actually a lot of interesting questions. For instance, there is value in captioning. It's not only people who are deaf and/or hard of hearing who use captioning, right? Many of us, without any disabilities or any limitations, we use captioning in our daily life. When we're at the airport, we use captioning to watch the news. At the gym, we use captioning. But realize that captioning also helps with the searchability of videos, right? If you want to do data analysis, big data, to analyze thousands of videos, if they all have captions, right, you can do text analysis. Suddenly, there's a lot of monetary value in those captions. Well, then there are questions about, okay, if the video content is yours and someone else captions it and there's value in that captioning, who owns the value in that captioning? That's an unclear legal question. Right? And there are interesting intersections, for instance, at the area of international development in developing countries. Right? How do we make sure that money spent by countries in developing countries is spent on accessible technology and not creating barriers, but instead on removing barriers? The UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Let me ask, how many people in the audience are familiar with that by show of hands, the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities? Okay, if you're not familiar with it, you should get familiar. There are a number of things in that treaty that relate to accessible technology. Articles 9 and 21 focus most closely on accessible technology. But there are other articles as well that relate to things like recreation and gaming, right? Articles that relate to education, articles that relate to employment, all of which do intersect with human-computer interaction and accessibility. So there are all these interesting intersections with human rights law and treaties and human-computer interaction. Treaties and human-computer interaction, who knew? But there are a lot of great areas where we should be doing work, and we can be doing work. It is very empowering when you realize that your research really can have an impact. When it gets cited in regulations, it is so exciting because regulatory processes can be slow sometimes. You respond to a call for comments, right? A year or two later, there's another call for comments. You've got the advanced notice of proposed rulemaking, and then the notice of proposed rulemaking, and then there's a proposed rule 3 years later, and it can be slow. But if you keep responding and keep staying involved, it really can make a difference. So, for instance, I did this research with my students about discriminatory pricing. When the websites of airlines are inaccessible and someone calls up and says, "I'm blind, your website doesn't work," we did research about how people who are blind get charged higher prices, or they charge the call center fee, which results in a higher price, even though under the US law you can't do that. So when the new final rule came out from the US Department of Transportation, it cited our research about pricing discrimination and why it's important that all websites for airlines must be accessible, because the equivalent accommodations are actually not equivalent. So that was really exciting. The Section 508 proposed rule. So in the US, Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act requires that all government technology, both for government employees and for websites for the public, be accessible. And the proposed rule actually cited my research about how much time people lose when websites are inaccessible. If you're blind, how much time is lost? And so if you keep responding to these regulations, and if you keep going when they have public hearings, and if you keep providing testimony throughout these processes, you really can have an impact. We are all incredibly powerful in our ability to change the world and to change the laws and the regulations. I want to encourage everyone to get out there and connect with government, with lawyers, with policymakers, with other communities. Every now and then, something funny happens. So, in 2014, one of the lawyer advocates that I work with said, "Jonathan, there's this district court trial that's coming up. You've got to come. It relates to blind users, it relates to voting, public policy, right? It relates to everything you like. This is your case. You need to sit in, just for the fun of it. You need to come to this." It related to online ballot marking. It was an online ballot marking tool for absentee voters, right? And the military voters were using this, and the blindness community said, "We want to have access to this too." And the state of Maryland said no. So I went to the hearing, and I was sitting there, and it was fascinating. How many people have ever been to a court trial? Just show of hands. Okay, great. Because you learn about how the legal system works. And so I was sitting there, and I learned a lot. And as I'm walking out, I'm talking, so the person who's to my right here, that's Ann Taylor, who used to, again, be Director of Access Technology at the National Federation of the Blind. She now works at Microsoft. And I was talking with Ann, this is when we were finishing up the book. So I was talking with Ann about the book, not paying attention. Literally, you see me kind of, my head is turned to her, and we're talking about our book. Right. So the next day, in the Maryland Daily Record, there's this photo. This photo, and it says, "Jonathan Lazar leads plaintiffs out of courtroom." Right? And it was so funny. I had nothing to do with the trial. I was not an expert witness. I was not a plaintiff. I was not a defendant. I was just coming to watch, right? The headline, "No online ballots for blind and disabled," was the headline in the paper. And then the caption talked about Jonathan Lazar leads plaintiffs out of the courtroom. And I thought it was funny because I had nothing to do with this trial. I was just watching. But it seems that in the legal field, this is a common picture. If you search on law schools and law firms, everywhere you look, they have pictures of lawyers in suits standing on the courthouse steps. So, you never know what will happen when you engage with other communities. There you go. So what I want to challenge us to do is to create new career paths. You know, very often what we do is we have a research topic, we work on it for 2 or 3 years, we build a prototype or two, and then we say, you know what, I'll move on. I'll go look at something different. I want us to change that approach, and I want us to find ways to create new career paths where we actually stay on the same topic, but every 2 or 3 years we change our angles of societal impact. We change how we are impacting society. So if you pick the same topic, you can do behavioral studies. You can develop prototypes and work on building those prototypes with corporate partners. You can work with legislators on legislation related to privacy, related to accessibility, related to intellectual property, right? I want to also challenge everyone to do longitudinal studies, right? It really is important to examine the same factors every 2, 3 years and have a pattern over 10, 15 years. That's something that we don't often do in HCI. A lot of other fields do, where they go out and every year they have data and they say, well, the trend lines are moving up. We need more funding. The trend lines just move down. So I want people to think about staying on the topics that interest you, but coming up with new approaches for societal impact. So for instance, if accessibility is what you are interested in, as I am, don't only do research and publish papers and work with legislators, but also work to make the IT systems on a campus more accessible. So I've had my students work in teams to work with our campus technology unit to make the technology more accessible for students with disabilities. I've worked with our disability student services at Towson University to help make the campus more inclusive. You know, I want to challenge all of you to form partnerships with disability-related advocacy groups. There are tons of groups out there. They want to work with you. They want to partner with you. They want to collaborate with you. And partner with outside groups, but also partner across your campus. As I mentioned, we started a cross-campus disability advocacy group at Towson. One thing I'm very proud of is the work that SIGCHI has made to become a more inclusive organization. And so from my years on the executive council, some of the leaders of the EC, as well as myself, we've been working to make SIGCHI more inclusive. And so you see, for instance, information in the paper templates about accessibility, right? I helped co-found the SIGCHI accessibility community, which helps feed information to the organization about what works and what doesn't. You even see a change this year with the Beam robots, where people can attend remotely, right, if maybe they're unable to travel. So there's a lot of work that we can do in all of these different locations, in all these different venues, with all these different communities to improve the inclusiveness, to make a difference, to use your research work, whether you are working in accessibility or not. There are so many areas where we need to make sure that our voice about human-computer interaction is heard in the general community. So we need to make sure, for instance, that we are out there talking in the public, in the greater dialogue, on news stations, in newspapers, in magazines. We need to get our message out there about the important work we do in HCI and how it is about improving the quality of life for people. One of the great things about spending all this time outside, working with other organizations, other fields, other communities, is you get a really good understanding of what your field is good at and maybe what your field's not so good at, right? You learn what your own field could improve in. So people from other communities may ask you questions that seem outlandish, and probably your questions to them will seem outlandish, right? But they're great. They give you insight, right? You get to get a totally different view. Realize that when you go out, other communities have different research methods. How we do human subjects research may be very different from how they do it in other fields, like in sociology or in healthcare. And you know what? That's great to go out and learn how they do research. If you haven't had the opportunity, for instance, to go observe at a hospital how they're using information technology, it is fascinating. It's a fascinating experience. Now, writing styles in other communities are very different as well. My experience has taught me that the lawyers write very formally, and they believe that computer scientists write very casually and very friendly, like an informal chat. So writing styles are different. Research methods are different, right? The styles of research are different. We can learn so much more by being outside our community and then returning with all these great ideas and continuing the collaboration. And as I mentioned, we need to do more longitudinal studies because policymakers don't often want to know if something's perfect. They want to know, how are we doing? So for instance, if you look at US federal websites, I receive this question all the time. So you did this study in 2011, how are we doing today? Has it improved? Has it gotten worse? How does that compare to 2008? How does it compare to 2001? Right? We need to do more longitudinal studies so we can talk about the trend lines. That helps show our impact. The impact that we have on making technology better, on improving the quality of life. The more that we can go out there and do a longitudinal study, that trend line helps convince people of why we do important work, and it's very important to policymakers. And as I mentioned, another great way that we can all work together, as they've been doing this year in 2016 in San Jose, we've been working to make SIGCHI and the CHI conference more inclusive. And I hope that we continue that work. But it's not enough just to say, great, we do good work. We have to find ways to measure this. That's why I said the longitudinal studies can help. We have to show the impact that we have. We need to have more stories about how our work has impacted real-world projects and people and how the quality of life has improved for people. So we need to summarize court cases that HCI people have been involved with. We need to talk about the impact we've had on regulations. We need to get our story out there in the mainstream media more. We need to have regular relationships with policymakers. A lot of the other science fields do. If you look at physicists, if you look at chemists, they are very active. We need to get, as an HCI community, we need to get more active in the existing computer science channels, in our national governments, in our multinational governments, right? With groups like the United Nations, getting involved with treaties, standards organizations. There's so much we can do to help improve design and make sure that we make a difference with our work. So get letters of testimonial, get letters of support. Find ways, we need to find metrics for measuring this. I'll give you an interesting example. Every time there's a news article that comes out where I mentioned, or one of my colleagues has mentioned, the dean sends us an email. Just so you know, your news article in USA Today gave us the equivalent marketing value of $19,000. Right? I know, I'm quite serious. Right? Realize that other fields do have metrics for measuring the value of marketing. Other fields have ways of measuring this. We need to learn about those alternative metrics and use that to help support the work that we do. We also need to learn to be uncomfortable. We need to learn to be uncomfortable and be okay with it. We need to get out there. When you are asked to present in a venue that's different from one you're familiar with, take up that offer, but don't only wait. We want to be forward. We want to go out there and contact organizations, policymakers, community groups. Be proactive. Don't just be reactive. Be proactive. Get out there. Contact organizations. Say, I want to be a part of your mission, and I want to find ways we can collaborate. And you know what? We're very used to, as researchers, saying, well, I'm going to start. Let's meet. I have a project I want to do. There are a lot of times where you can't start that way. You can't start by saying, I have a project. You should start by saying, I want to get to know you. I want to find out what your organization does. I want to find out about your needs, and maybe a project will develop over time. So don't just wait to be invited. Reach out to people. Make the effort. And as you go out and you're learning to be uncomfortable, one important part of that is to make sure that you acknowledge when you can't answer a question. So if a question is outside of your area of expertise, acknowledge it. So one of the times I was testifying to the Maryland State Legislature, one of the state senators asked me, well, sir, you said that this law is needed. Why are the current remedies in the law not sufficient? I said, current remedies in the law. That sounds to me, that's a legal question. That's not really a technical computer science question. Remedies in the law, I'm sorry, I'm really not qualified to answer that. And the senator came at me again. But sir, certainly if you're in favor of this law, you can tell us more about the remedies and the existing remedies. And I said, unfortunately, sir, I cannot. Those are strictly legal questions. And as someone who does human-computer interaction, I suggest you talk to one of these lawyers standing behind me. There are some brilliant lawyers standing behind me. You should ask one of them. And I named the lawyers, and I said, I'll bet they would know. But you have to acknowledge. You can't just answer everything. You have to acknowledge, if you're in a medical community and there's a question related to healthcare that's deeply a medical question, you have to acknowledge and say, yeah, sorry, I don't know. That's outside of my area of expertise. One thing I want us to do as a community is to highlight the people in the CHI community who have actually taken time to become policymakers. So we have a number of people within the SIGCHI community who have taken a year or two leave of absence, right? And they've worked in government. So I see Lori Craner is here, right? Lori currently is at the Federal Trade Commission on leave as their chief technologist. People like Jan Gullikson, who served as the digital champion of Sweden. Clayton Lewis from University of Colorado, right? Clayton and Kathy McCoy as well, the two of them actually served at the US Department of Education in the National Institutes in Disability Rehabilitation and Research, which now has a totally different name and is in a different department. But there are people who are out there making a difference, right? Who are out there connecting with policymakers. And I'm sure the first few months, working in a government agency, working in a national capital, I'm sure it's uncomfortable. And that's great, because you're going to come back then with all these great ideas, right? We have people in the community who spend a lot of time partnering with government, partnering with policymakers, partnering with lawyers, right, on voting machines and voting design. So we want to encourage as many people as possible to get out there. We've got a great community. It's a supportive community. It's a kind community. It's a fun community. And what we want to do is find ways to get out there more and tell the story of our community and the work we do, and use our knowledge to make the world a better place. Because we have the ability to change the world. You saw on my first slides my story of how I got involved in HCI. I learned about HCI and I got excited because it was about using technology to improve the quality of life. It was about making life better. It was about having a societal impact. That's why I was attracted to HCI. And that's why I believe that we can make a difference. So I challenge all of you. We have the ability to change the world. Will we step outside of our comfort zone? And to paraphrase Gandhi, will we be the change in the world that we want to see? We can do this. We have the knowledge. We have the skills. We have the technical expertise. I want to challenge everyone to get out there and to be the change in the world that we want to see. Thank you very much. So we have time for questions. Who has questions, comments?
Hi, Jonathan.
Hi.
So I had a question. As a young faculty member, I think all of this is really important, and I'd really like to incorporate a lot of the kind of outreach that you've done into my own academic career.
Right.
But it's hard to see how to do that and to get people to see the value in it until it's successful. So can you talk a little bit about how you fit this into your academic career and how you kind of convince people, like, oh, the several years that it took to get this law to pass was as important as once it was actually passed?
Absolutely, absolutely. Great question. And that is, right, that is a real question for people who are young in their career and who are starting out. It's important to have these ongoing relationships. And that's part of it, because even if you have not had an impact yet, right? But if you've been collaborating and partnering, you can get letters of support. Letters of support from the community about the impact that your work has had are very useful, right? And in terms of just balancing it as a young faculty member, as a young researcher working in an industrial lab, right? If you think of your social impact mission as being at the core of what you do, you can find ways to structure, for instance, your teaching, your research about social impact, about societal impact. Because, for instance, when you do real-world projects, they're better for learning. Most students don't want to learn out of a textbook, watch PowerPoint slides, and then take an exam. They want to do something hands-on, right? They want to build something. They are much better off building something and failing, right, than just reading something from a textbook. And so if you think of it that way, in terms of how you structure your educational activities, structure them in a way that there's some real benefit to society, and tell students up front, you know what? You're going to learn something. It's going to be a great experience. It may not turn out perfect, right? We have to accept that. Guess what? In the real world, many projects don't come to fruition. They don't finish out well. So that helps prepare students. But if you think of that, structuring the educational activities, and it's these long-term relationships that are really important. I don't want us to think about doing drive-by research, where you call up an organization, hi, right, I need some people in wheelchairs, can you help me out? Right? No organization wants to work with a researcher who does that. Instead, you want to form long-term partnerships. And those long-term partnerships, even if, let's say, you have not had a major success and something's come to fruition, those long-term partnerships can actually help prove the value of what you're doing. So if you think about it, students will rave about the hands-on projects in the community you're doing. They learn something more. They see the impact. I mean, I see students. Sometimes I'll run into students at the mall or something, and they will say, oh, Dr. Lazar, that project about pricing discrimination, yeah, I remember that. Or, yeah, we visited blind people. I never forgot about blind people using power tools to build furniture. I never forgot that. So really, if you build your teaching around societal impact, it's just great teaching. And students love it, right? If you build these partnerships, you'll have community partners who will be happy to speak on your behalf. And even if, let's say, you have not, something like regulations, yeah, that may take some time. But you know what? If you've built a relationship with the policymakers who are involved, right, then you really have something that you can talk about. And I've been collaborating, I've been meeting, they will write letters of support. So these are the types of things that I would suggest doing. In terms of your service, universities love community outreach. They love you getting out there, right? Because again, it helps increase their name recognition in the community. Yep. Hi, Ben.
Thank you, Jonathan, for your inspirational talk and for your inspirational work. It's quite wonderful. And I especially appreciate that you mentioned others who are doing things, Laurie Craner here, yep. Others who have worked, Sarah Horton, Whitney Quisenberry.
Yep.
People
Whitney, Center for Civic Design, yeah.
Ben
Whitney,
Peterson and voting and other efforts that do it. I think there are people going on that are doing things. You call for we need to do more. I'd like to push you to your uncomfortable position.
Okay.
To, I would say, maybe not now, but let's start a discussion. What are the 6 things you would like the CHI EC to take on and change? What specific things with a deadline? Not say, let's do more of, but what can they do at their next meeting to produce change? Change happens one specific thing at a time. The second set of 6 things are for the CHI 2017 Conference Committee. Conference committees and the EC are the way things happen in this community. And making small things, making visibility, making changes. I'm quite gratified as I walk around this conference. First time I've seen it, maybe I hadn't noticed so much before, there are lots of blind people, there are people with disabilities, and they are getting assistance from the volunteers, and that's great that we are, they are part of the community. But I'd like you to, maybe you can start now, but I hope you, within the next week, would send an email to the SIGCHI EC and the 2017 committee with the 6 things. If you want me to sign on to it, I'll sign on to it. But let's get a list of very specific things that can be done on a schedule.
Fantastic. Thank you for that suggestion. Let me first suggest, if you're interested in things that we can do as a community to engage more with public policy, tomorrow afternoon, there is a panel about that. There's actually an article, when I served on the EC, there was an article that we wrote, 31 co-authors from 10 countries, about how the HCI community can engage more with policymakers. And so there will be a panel discussion tomorrow afternoon, so certainly come to that. In terms of inclusiveness, that's something that the SIGCHI EC, when I served on the EC, we've really worked hard on. To, again, the beam robots, right? Making sure that there is, for instance, you may not have seen it up here, but there was CART available. There was real-time captioning available at the morning plenary. So the registration forms include questions about accessibility. So there is a lot of work in terms of inclusiveness. In terms of engaging with public policy, right? I suggest, and I will forward a list of suggestions, but we need more highlighting of the success, the people in the community who do this, as you were mentioning, people who have people.
But get past the "we need." "We need" is an evasive phrase.
Okay.
The who is it that you want to take the action? What is it that you're going to do? What do you want me to do? What do you want Lauren and the EC to do? Get past "we need."
Okay. I will send a list of those suggestions from the report, because the report we published in 2015 actually does have an itemized list of how the SIGCHI organization can increase the awareness of public policy, right? Related to, for instance, funding people to come, policymakers to come to the conference and speak about policy, people who are in policy positions, funding people to spend a semester off, for instance, from a university working as a policymaker or learning about public policy, funding workshops on an annual basis related to public policy. So I do have an itemized list from that report, and I will send it. So it's funding annual workshops. It's holding events related to public policy at the CHI conference and other conferences. There's an itemized list. I have it. I'm ready to go.
Change happens one email at a time.
All right. Thank you, Ben.
Thanks, Jonathan, and thank you, Ben. And congratulations again on your award and for an inspiring talk. I guess one of your very first slides, it sort of poked me in a way, or it stimulated me. That's what I mean,
not on purpose.
Yeah. No, it was, you said something like, you know, don't work on problems that you're interested in, instead work on problems out there in the world. And it's interesting because it's not that I disagree with that, but it's, you put yourself firmly on one side of our field, which is go solve problems as opposed to go innovate. You know, what drives some people is to create new technologies, new ways of interacting. And we've seen in the world many success stories of people doing those things where the application wasn't clear, and then they totally transformed things. And so I guess for the people who have that as their passion, what should they get out of your talk?
Okay, great question, Lauren. So what I meant by that is that often we run into situations where we have researchers or students who say, here's a problem I want to work on. And you say, well, that's not really a problem that needs to be solved, right? And I say, let's focus, right? We want innovation, but we want to determine where we need innovation. So I'll give the example. I had a doctoral student who came to me and said, Dr. Lazar, I've decided I want to build a new operating system for blind people. And I said, okay, so how did you get that idea? Did you interact with some blind people? Do you have anyone blind in your family? Do you have any friends? No. Right? I said, well, have you read feedback online? And I was trying to figure out how has this student determined that that's actually a need, that's a problem that needs to be solved. And he had never spoken with a single blind person ever. He just had the idea that for my dissertation, I want to create a new operating system for blind people. And I said, that's not really the approach we should be taking, right? I definitely want innovation, but the source of that innovation should be where are there existing needs in the world, right? And that's where I want people to innovate. So I didn't say don't innovate what you're interested in. I said look for the areas, and we have so many needs in the area of public health around the world. In lean countries, we have so many needs in terms of people with disabilities and equal access. We have so many needs in terms of people who are socioeconomically disadvantaged and how we're going to make sure that they get access to technology. We have so many needs. We should first go out and figure out where are these needs, where can we play a role, and then we should innovate. What I want to avoid is that student who just said, I have this idea, and it's not based on a real world need. It's not based on actually solving something. Because there's nothing as frustrating as doing a project, right? And nothing happens to it. You get your CHI paper, and that's it. That's the end. The paper should be the beginning. It should be the beginning of the path, the beginning of the journey to continuing this work and finding ways that we can impact society doing this. So, thank you.
Our last question?
Are we? Do we have time for one more?
It's actually 10:50.
Oh, okay.
So I think we should stay on schedule, so I apologize. Okay, I'll go up and...
Absolutely. I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. Come talk with me. Absolutely. Thank you.